At 16, my grandmother tried to marry me off against my will. So I uncovered and exposed the trafficking ring she'd been running for years. I should have known something was wrong when grandmother Mildred started measuring my hips at breakfast. Not casually, with an actual tape measure while I was trying to eat Frosted Flakes. 34 inches, she announced to my mother, scribbling notes in her leather book. Perfect breeding proportions. I nearly choked on my Frosted Flakes. What's happening? I asked. But Mom just stared into her coffee like it held the secrets of the universe. For 3 months, strange men had been visiting our house. They'd sit in grandmother's parlor drinking tea, while she paraded me around like a show pony. I was told they were business associates, but something about their stares made my skin crawl. The truth hit me when I found the contracts. I was looking for my birth certificate when I discovered grandmother's filing cabinet wasn't locked. Inside were dozens of folders labeled with girls' names, ages, and what looked like invoices. My hand shook as I opened the folder marked Sophia. Age 16. That was me. Sophia was my real name, though everyone called me Sophie. The papers inside made me sick. Medical records I'd never consented to. Photos someone had taken without my knowledge. And worst of all, a signed contract between my grandmother and someone named Nikolai Volkov for $45,000. I was being sold. The medical records were horrifying. They detailed everything. Confirmation I was still a virgin, fertility assessments, even dental records. At the bottom, in grandmother's handwriting. Delivery date March 15th, payment upon receipt. March 15th was next week. That night, I pretended to have food poisoning and stayed in my room, photographing every document. There were 17 other girls' files. Some I recognized from high school. Others were unfamiliar with notes like delivered or payment complete. One file made me physically vomit. A girl named Maya, only 14, with a bright red deceased stamp across her photo. I had stumbled onto something much bigger than an arranged marriage. The next morning, grandmother announced my wedding to the family. Sophie will be moving to Eastern Europe next week, she said over pancakes, as casually as discussing the weather. She's marrying a successful businessman who will provide well for her. My father looked confused. Since when? Since it was decided, grandmother cut him off with a look that could freeze hell. I excused myself and called my cousin Mateo, who was studying forensic psychology. When I sent him the photos, his response was immediate. Holy Sophie, this is human trafficking. Call the FBI now. But I couldn't. Not yet. Because that afternoon, I overheard grandmother coordinating with someone about other girls being moved the same week. This was happening to others right now. I needed more evidence. For 3 days, I became a spy in my own home. I recorded conversations, photographed visitor license plates, and documented every detail. She had been doing this for years, selling girls from our community to buyers overseas. The breaking point came when I discovered they planned to drug me. She's been asking too many questions, I heard grandmother tell someone. Give her the sedative in her morning orange juice. She'll sleep until Warsaw. Warsaw. I was being shipped to Warsaw like cargo. That night, I created a digital evidence package. Photos, audio recordings, financial records. I uploaded it all to a secure cloud drive and prepared to send it to the FBI, local police, and media outlets. But first I had one more thing to do. The next morning, grandmother gathered the family for my farewell breakfast. Mom sat crying. Dad looked lost. My little brother Leo kept asking why I had to leave. As grandmother raised her orange juice in a toast to new beginnings, I stood up. Before we toast, I said, pulling out my phone, I have something to share. I hit play on the recording of her discussing my sale price. The room went dead silent. You sick? My father whispered, finally understanding. Grandmother lunged for my phone, but I was faster. I'd already hit send on 18 different emails. Too late, I said. The FBI should be here any minute. And that's when she told me something that made my blood run cold. You stupid girl, she hissed. You have no idea how deep this goes. Your precious family is already on the list. Your mother agreed to this. Your father signed the papers. I turned to look at my parents. Mom wouldn't meet my eyes. Dad's face had gone white as fresh snow. What is she talking about? I demanded, my voice cracking like brittle glass. The silence stretched until my mother finally broke, her words coming out in broken sobs. We owed them money, she whispered, her hands shaking around her coffee cup. Gambling debts. Your father's gambling debts. They said this was the only way to make it right. My father stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair with a crash that echoed through our small dining room. Mildred said it was just an arranged marriage, he said desperately, his voice rising to almost a shout. Rich husband, good life in Europe. She never told us. Never said what? Grandmother laughed bitterly. A sound like nails on a chalkboard. Never said you were selling your daughter to pay off your poker losses? Never said these men don't take wives, they take slaves? Never said half these girls end up dead within a year? The room started spinning. My own parents had sold me. My own blood, my own flesh and bone had put a price tag on my head and shaken hands on the deal. That's when the front door exploded open with a crash that shook the entire house. FBI, everyone on the ground, hands where we can see them. Agents flooded our dining room in full tactical gear, automatic weapons drawn, shouting commands that barely registered through the roaring in my ears. In the chaos, I saw grandmother frantically trying to destroy papers, stuffing them in her mouth and chewing desperately. My mother collapsed, sobbing on the linoleum floor. My father was being handcuffed, his face a mask of confusion and terror. Agent Sarah Chun found me huddled in the corner behind the overturned chair, still clutching my phone like a lifeline. "Are you Sophia Morales?" she asked gently, her voice cutting through the chaos with surprising calm. I nodded, unable to speak. "You're safe now, honey. Your evidence package was incredibly thorough. We've been tracking this network for 8 months, but we never had an inside source with this level of access." Over the next several hours, sitting in a sterile FBI conference room with terrible fluorescent lighting, I learned the full scope of what grandmother had been orchestrating. Her Blessed Union's cultural marriage services was a front for an international trafficking ring that spanned 3 continents. She'd been operating for 15 years, targeting families in financial distress throughout Latino communities across the Sun Belt, and convincing them to marry off their daughters for debt forgiveness and promises of prosperity. The girls were never seen again. Maya, the 14-year-old whose file I'd found with the red deceased stamp, had died trying to escape a brothel in Belarus after being beaten so severely she suffered internal bleeding. 17 other girls had simply vanished into the network, their families receiving occasional fake letters and photos to maintain the illusion they were living happy married lives. "Your grandmother was what we call a Tier 1 recruiter," Agent Chun explained, sliding a thick folder across the metal table. She identified vulnerable families, built trust within communities through church connections and cultural organizations, then exploited desperate financial situations to convince parents they were doing what was best for their daughters. The financial records I'd photographed revealed transactions totaling over $1.2 million across multiple years, with individual sales ranging from $25,000 for younger girls to $65,000 for older teenagers with specific physical characteristics buyers had requested. Agent Chun opened the folder to reveal surveillance photos I'd never seen before. Pictures of grandmother meeting with men in expensive suits at upscale restaurants, exchanging briefcases in hotel parking lots, even boarding private jets with young girls who looked terrified and confused. "We've been building this case since 2019, she continued. But trafficking networks are like icebergs. We could only see the tip. Your evidence gave us the entire underwater structure." During questioning, more family secrets emerged that made my stomach turn. My parents had been in debt for $47,000 from Dad's gambling addiction that had spiraled out of control over 3 years. What started as occasional poker games had escalated to daily casino visits, online betting, and eventually desperate loans from increasingly dangerous people. Grandmother had offered to clear the entire debt in exchange for me, presenting herself as a savior, offering a solution that would benefit everyone involved. She had photographs. My mother sobbed during her interrogation, her mascara creating black rivers down her cheeks. Pictures of other girls who'd married through her service. Beautiful houses, expensive clothes, jewelry. She said Sophie would live like a princess in Europe, that these men specifically wanted American wives they could spoil and pamper. But the medical exams grandmother had secretly arranged through her network told a completely different story. The buyers weren't looking for wives to spoil. They were purchasing young, healthy girls for exploitation in various forms of forced labor, including prostitution, domestic servitude, and in some cases organ harvesting. "Did you know about the other girls in your community who had gone missing?" Agent Chun asked my parents during their second day of questioning. My mother broke down completely, her entire body shaking with sobs that sounded like they were being torn from her soul. We suspected something was wrong when the Johnson girl went missing last year, she confessed. Emily was only 15 when she left for her wedding in Romania. Her mother kept asking Mildred for more contact information, saying the letters Emily was sending didn't sound like her voice, but Mildred always had explanations. Cultural adjustment, learning a new language, being busy with her new wealthy lifestyle. The letters were fake. Emily Johnson had been killed 6 months after her wedding, while trying to escape a trafficking compound in Kiev. Her body was never recovered. Agent Chun slid another photograph across the table. A surveillance image from Ukrainian police showing a young girl who looked like Emily being forced into a van outside a train station. This was taken 2 days before she died, Agent Chun said quietly. She'd managed to escape the compound and made it almost to the embassy before they caught her. My father, sitting in his orange jail jumpsuit, stared at the photo with haunted eyes. How many? He whispered. How many girls did we help kill by staying silent? 46. Agent Chun replied without hesitation. That's how many girls your mother-in-law trafficked during her 15-year operation. Sophia would have been number 47. 3 days later, the coordinated raids began. Using my evidence and testimony, along with months of FBI surveillance, agents simultaneously struck 12 locations across 4 states: Texas, Arizona, Florida, and Georgia. The operation involved over 200 federal agents, local police officers, and international law enforcement partners. They arrested grandmother at 6 a.m., while she was trying to flee to Mexico with 3 suitcases full of cash and fake identification documents. She fought like a wild cat, scratching one agent's face and biting another before they could get the handcuffs on her. Sergei Kuznetsov, who was actually Viktor Petrov, a convicted trafficker who'd been on Interpol's most wanted list for 7 years, was arrested at a luxury hotel in Dallas, where he'd been waiting for my delivery. When agents broke down his door, they found him with detailed plans for transporting 4 girls to various international destinations that same week. The safe house where I was supposed to be taken was raided simultaneously by a joint task force. Located in a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of Austin, it had been set up to look like a legitimate shipping business from the outside. Inside they found 4 other girls. Isabella Sanchez, 17, from San Antonio, had been held there for 3 weeks. She'd lost 30 pounds and had visible track marks on her arms from sedatives they'd been using to keep her compliant. Olivia Miller, 15, from Houston, had been there for 10 days. Her marriage to a businessman in Poland had been scheduled for the following week. Camila Garcia, 16, from Dallas, had arrived just 2 days before the raid. She was still fighting them, still had fire in her eyes, still believed someone would come looking for her. And Chloe Davis, 14, the youngest, who'd been trafficked from San Diego after her family was convinced she was being adopted by a wealthy American couple who wanted to give her educational opportunities they couldn't afford. All 4 girls were rescued alive, though the psychological trauma would take years to heal. The media coverage was intense and unrelenting. Local news stations called it the largest human trafficking bust in state history. National outlets picked up the story when they learned a 16-year-old girl had single-handedly exposed an international trafficking network by documenting her own attempted sale. NBC News interviewed me via satellite from the FBI safe house where I was staying. What made you realize you had to document everything instead of just running away? Lester Holt asked. I found Maya's file, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She was 14 when they killed her. I kept thinking about all the other Mayas who might be saved if someone could prove what was really happening. I couldn't live with myself if I escaped but left the door open for them to keep destroying lives. But the aftermath wasn't what I expected. My family didn't just fall apart. It disintegrated completely like a house of cards in a hurricane. Dad was charged as an accessory to human trafficking, but got a plea deal for cooperating fully with prosecutors and providing detailed information about grandmother's operation. He received 5 years in federal prison, but would serve only 18 months with good behavior and continued cooperation. Mom was charged with child endangerment and conspiracy, but avoided prison time by agreeing to 3 years of supervised probation and 500 hours of community service with anti-trafficking organizations. Leo, my 12-year-old brother, went to live with our Aunt Elena in Chicago. He was too young to understand the full scope of what had happened, but old enough to know our family had been destroyed by choices the adults made. The first time I saw him after the arrests, he wouldn't look at me. "Why did you have to tell?" he asked quietly, his small hands twisted together in his lap. "Now everyone at high school knows what our family did. Now I don't have a mom or dad anymore." It broke my heart into pieces so small, I wasn't sure they could ever be put back together. I testified against grandmother at her trial, which lasted 6 weeks and made national headlines daily. She showed no remorse whatsoever, even when faced with 17 counts of human trafficking, 6 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and dozens of other federal charges connected to girls who died in the network. Her defense attorney tried to paint her as a victim of circumstance, a woman who'd grown up in poverty and abuse who was simply trying to help families escape similar situations. But when the prosecutor asked her directly about Maya, about Emily, about the other girls whose deaths were directly connected to her trafficking operation, she showed her true nature. "These girls had better lives than what they were leaving," she said coldly, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used when discussing my hip measurements. "I gave them opportunities they never would have had otherwise. If some of them were too weak to adapt to their new circumstances, that's not my responsibility." The courtroom was dead silent. Even her own attorney looked sick. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd been handling trafficking cases for over 20 years, leaned forward with an expression of barely controlled disgust. "Ma'am, you facilitated the sale, rape, torture, and murder of dozens of children for profit. You destroyed families, traumatized communities, and showed absolutely no regard for human life. This court finds you to be a dangerous predator who poses an ongoing threat to society." She sentenced grandmother to life without the possibility of parole, plus 300 additional years to run consecutively. As they led her away in shackles, grandmother turned to look directly at me in the witness gallery. Her eyes were filled with pure hatred, but also something else, fear. For the first time in my life, the woman who had terrified me since childhood looked small and powerless. During the trial, I learned even more disturbing details about the scope of the operation. Grandmother had been abused and sold herself as a young girl in Mexico, trafficked across the border at age 13 by men who promised her family she'd find work as a maid for wealthy Americans. Instead, she spent 3 years in forced prostitution before escaping during a police raid in San Antonio. Rather than breaking the cycle of abuse, she decided to profit from it, convincing herself that she was giving girls opportunities while building a network that generated millions in revenue. "Trauma doesn't excuse evil," Agent Chan told me after the sentencing. "Some people who experience horrific abuse dedicate their lives to protecting others from the same fate. Others become predators themselves, perpetuating the cycle because they've learned to see exploitation as normal." The psychological evaluation conducted by federal experts revealed that grandmother had been operating similar trafficking networks in Nevada, Florida, and Arizona over the past 20 years. I was number 46 on her master list of trafficked girls. 6 months after the trial ended, I was invited to testify before Congress about gaps in human trafficking prevention and prosecution. Standing at that podium in the House of Representatives, looking out at dozens of lawmakers who had the power to change systems, I thought about Maya, about Emily, about all the girls whose names I'd never learn. The average age of entry into trafficking in the United States is 12 to 14 years old, I told them, reading from testimony I'd prepared with help from victim advocates. These aren't strangers snatching children off the street. 83% of trafficking victims are trafficked by people they know and trust. Family members, family friends, romantic partners, and community leaders. The Sophia Act was passed unanimously 4 months later. It requires extensive background checks for international marriage brokers, creates stronger federal penalties for family members who knowingly participate in trafficking, establishes mandatory training for school counselors and teachers to identify trafficking victims, and provides funding for survivor services. The bill was signed into law on Maya's birthday. She would have turned 18 that day. The rescued girls and I stay in close touch through a support group that meets every month. We call ourselves the Phoenix Sisters, women who rose from the ashes of what was supposed to destroy us. Isabella, who'd lost so much weight in the safe house, is now studying to become a registered dietitian, wanting to help other trauma survivors rebuild their relationships with food and their bodies. Olivia, the 15-year-old who was supposed to be shipped to Poland, is studying human rights law with plans to work for organizations that combat trafficking worldwide. Camila, who never stopped fighting even in captivity, became a martial arts instructor who teaches free classes for at-risk girls in her community. Chloe, the youngest at 14, is now in therapy and doing well in high school, but still struggles with trust issues and nightmares. She's the reminder that some trauma takes years to heal, if it ever fully heals at all. We support each other through the difficult days, the anniversaries of our near trafficking, the moments when memories overwhelm us, the times when well-meaning people ask intrusive questions about our experiences. During one particularly difficult group session, Olivia asked a question that haunted all of us. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Sophie hadn't been brave enough to document everything? How many more girls would have disappeared? Agent Chun, who sometimes joined our group sessions, answered honestly. Based on the intelligence we gathered, the network was expanding rapidly. They had plans to begin recruiting from middle schools, targeting even younger girls. Without Sophia's evidence, we estimate they would have trafficked at least 50 more victims in the following year alone. 50 more Mayas, 50 more Emilis, 50 more girls whose families would receive fake letters while their daughters suffered unimaginable horrors. Dad got out of prison after 18 months exactly as predicted. He'd been a model prisoner, participating in every counseling program available, leading a Gamblers Anonymous group, and continuing to cooperate with ongoing trafficking investigations. He wrote me letters constantly during his incarceration, long rambling confessions about his gambling addiction, desperate apologies for what he'd allowed to happen, promises that he'd changed. Please forgiveness that I wasn't ready to give. I know I don't deserve it, his final letter read. But I hope someday you can find it in your heart to let me try to be your father again. I failed you in the worst possible way, but I want to spend the rest of my life making it right. I never wrote back. When he was released, he moved to a halfway house in Nashville and got a job washing dishes at a diner. He started attending meetings for parents of trafficking victims, speaking about the warning signs he'd ignored, the desperation that had made him vulnerable to grandmother's manipulation, but I couldn't bring myself to see him. Every time I thought about that breakfast table, about him signing papers that put a price on my life, the anger rose up like bile in my throat. Mom had a different kind of breakdown after the trial. She developed severe agoraphobia and couldn't leave her apartment for months. She lost her job, had to move to a smaller place, and started drinking heavily to cope with the guilt and shame. She sent birthday cards every year that I threw away unopened. She left voicemails that I deleted without listening to. She reached out through Aunt Elena, begging for just one chance to explain, to apologize, to try to repair what she'd helped destroy. But I couldn't forgive her either. Not yet, maybe not ever, because she'd had a choice. When grandmother presented that contract, when those men came to evaluate me like livestock, when the medical exams were scheduled, she'd had opportunities to say no, to protect me, to find another solution. Instead, she chose to save herself and sacrifice me. Leo wrote to me sometimes from Chicago. Aunt Elena sent pictures of him playing baseball, graduating 8th grade, smiling with friends. He was healing in ways the rest of us couldn't. But in his letters, I could sense the weight he carried. The knowledge that his family had been willing to sell his sister, the confusion about why everything had to fall apart, the fear that people would always see him as connected to the trafficking operation. Do you hate Mom and Dad? He asked in one letter. I stared at that question for hours before writing back. I don't hate them, I finally replied. But I can't trust them, and I can't pretend that what they did was okay just because they were scared or desperate. Some things can't be forgiven, even by family. Last year I got a call from Agent Chun that changed everything. We found something you should know about, she said, her voice carrying that careful tone she used when delivering news that could be good or devastating. They discovered grandmother's real records. Not the files I'd found in her cabinet, but her actual master database hidden in a safety deposit box registered under a fake name in 3 different states. She kept detailed notes about every girl she trafficked over 20 years, Agent Chen explained, including their final locations, the buyers' real identities, and in some cases what happened to them after the sales were completed. My heart stopped. Maya, we've been able to rescue 3 more girls using her information, Agent Chen said. They're alive because of your courage to expose this network when you did. Maya, the 14-year-old I thought was dead based on the deceased stamp in her file, was actually being held in a compound in Romania. The death certificate had been forged to close her case and stop any family inquiries. When Romanian authorities raided the location based on grandmother's intelligence, they found Maya, now 17, along with 8 other trafficking victims from various countries. She'd been forced into prostitution for 3 years, had suffered multiple injuries and infections, and had tried to kill herself twice, but she was alive. The first time I spoke to Maya via video call, arranged through victim services and international law enforcement, I barely recognized the laughing girl from the high school photos I'd seen in her file. She was painfully thin. Her hair had been shaved off, and she had scars on her arms that told stories I didn't want to imagine. But her eyes still held fire. "You saved my life," she said in accented English she'd learned during recovery. When police came, they said an American girl named Sophia gave them information to find us. "I knew it was you from the news stories." I started crying and couldn't stop. "I thought you were dead," I whispered. "I saw the stamp in your file. I thought I was too late to help you." "You were not too late," she said firmly. "Every day in that place I hoped someone would come. I never stopped believing, and you made it happen." Maya is now in intensive therapy and rehabilitation in Romania, working with organizations that help trafficking survivors rebuild their lives. She wants to become a victim advocate to help other girls who experience what she experienced. The 2 other rescued girls were Ana Garcia from Honduras, who'd been trafficked at 15 and held for 2 years in a domestic servitude situation in Ireland, and Kimiko Sato from Japan, who'd been sold into forced labor in a factory in Vietnam at age 16. All 3 girls credit my exposure of the network with saving their lives. "We've been able to rescue 3 girls and prosecute 17 additional traffickers using the intelligence from your grandmother's records," Agent Chan told me. "But there's something else. We've identified 12 other families who were targeted by the network, but didn't go through with the transactions. Your case going public scared them away from participating. 12 more families. 12 more girls who didn't disappear because other parents saw the news coverage and realized what they'd almost done to their own daughters." The ripple effects kept spreading. Detective Emily Rodriguez from Dallas PD started a task force specifically focused on family-facilitated trafficking, after seeing how common it was in grandmother's network. "People think trafficking is always strangers grabbing kids," she told a reporter. "But family trafficking is actually the fastest-growing category we're seeing. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, people who are supposed to protect children, selling them to pay debts, support drug habits, or just for money." The task force has investigated 47 cases in 3 years and rescued 23 children from family trafficking situations. "I'm 19 now, starting my sophomore year at New York University with a full scholarship funded by donations from people who heard my story. I'm double majoring in human rights law and psychology with plans to work for organizations that combat trafficking worldwide. My dorm room is covered with photos of Maya, Isabella, Olivia, Camila, and Chloe. Reminders of why I survived, why I spoke up, why I can never stop fighting for girls who are still trapped in the network that was supposed to consume me. Every semester, I get letters from girls who've escaped trafficking situations after learning about warning signs from news coverage of my case. A 15-year-old in Florida called the trafficking hotline when her aunt started arranging her marriage to an older man, leading to the discovery of a network targeting girls in immigrant communities. A 16-year-old in Arizona recognized the manipulation tactics her boyfriend was using to isolate her from family and friends, realizing he was grooming her for trafficking before it escalated. A 14-year-old in Georgia told her high school counselor when her stepfather started talking about introducing her to business opportunities with his friends, preventing what investigators later determined would have been a sale into domestic servitude. "These are the victories that keep me going when the nightmares come. When I wake up in cold sweats thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't found those files, if I hadn't been brave enough to document everything, if I just tried to run instead of fighting back." Last month, I received a letter that made me realize how far the consequences of my choice had reached. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a professor at Harvard University who studies family trafficking patterns, wrote to tell me that my case had become a cornerstone study in her field. "The documentation you gathered and the courage you showed in exposing your own family's participation has fundamentally changed how we understand and combat trafficking," she wrote. "Your case is taught in criminal justice programs, social work schools, and law enforcement across the country. The Sophia Protocol is now standard procedure when investigating suspected trafficking cases, looking for family involvement, documenting financial motivations, and understanding how traffickers manipulate cultural expectations and economic desperation to convince families to participate. But the letter that affected me most came from an unexpected source. Sergei Kuznetsov, the man who was supposed to be my husband, wrote to me from federal prison where he's serving life without parole. "You destroyed my life," his letter began. And I almost threw it away immediately, but something made me keep reading. "I have spent 3 years in this cell thinking about what you did, and I realize now that you destroyed the life of a monster. You saved those girls, but you also saved me from becoming even worse than I already was." He went on to describe his own childhood in Russia, how he'd been sold by his family to criminal organizations at age 12, how years of abuse had turned him into someone who saw children as commodities instead of human beings. "I am not asking for forgiveness," he wrote. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I am telling you that what you did was right and brave and necessary. You stopped me from destroying more lives. You stopped your grandmother from destroying more families. You changed everything." At the end of the letter, he included information about 3 other trafficking networks he'd worked with during his criminal career, details he was sharing with federal prosecutors in hopes that more victims could be rescued. I forwarded his letter to Agent Chun, who confirmed that his information had already led to 2 more arrests and the rescue of 1 additional trafficking victim. Even the man who was supposed to destroy my life had been changed by my choice to fight back. When people ask if I regret exposing my family, if I regret destroying the only life I'd ever known, I think about Maya video calling me from Romania to show me the painting she'd finished in art therapy. I think about Isabella teaching a self-defense class to middle school girls, empowering them to protect themselves. I think about Olivia interning with an international human rights organization, using her experience to help draft policies that protect trafficking victims. I think about Camila speaking at conferences about survivor empowerment, refusing to let her trauma define her limitations. I think about Chloe, still healing but alive, still fighting, still believing that the world can be good despite everything she's endured. I think about the 43 other girls on grandmother's list who will never be sold because the network is destroyed. I think about the 12 families who decided not to participate after seeing the consequences of what my family did. I think about the investigators who used my case to recognize warning signs in other families. I think about the laws that have changed because lawmakers saw what happens when trafficking hides behind cultural traditions and family authority. And I remember what grandmother said during her final phone call from prison 6 months before she died of a heart attack in her cell. "You destroyed your own family," she hissed, her voice as cold and bitter as ever. Was it worth it? Was destroying everyone you loved worth saving a few strangers? I thought about Leo, who was safe with Aunt Elena and thriving in high school, no longer living in a house where children could be sold to pay adult debts. I thought about the girls who were alive because I spoke up, because I documented everything, because I chose truth over family loyalty. I thought about the families who had never faced this choice because the network that preyed on them was gone. Yes, I told her, my voice steady and sure. It was worth it. Saving those girls was worth everything. And I hung up on her forever. 3 years later, I still believe that. Even on the hard days, even when I miss having a family, even when I wonder what my life would have looked like if I just kept quiet and found another way to escape, because some things are more important than family loyalty. Some things are more important than keeping secrets. Some fights are worth losing everything for. And some choices once made define who you are forever. I chose to be someone who protects children instead of someone who stays silent while they're destroyed. I chose to be someone who documents truth instead of someone who lives comfortable lies. I chose to be someone who breaks cycles instead of someone who perpetuates them. And every day when I wake up in my dorm room covered with photos of survivors, when I read letters from girls who escaped because of warnings my case provided, when I study human rights law so I can fight trafficking on a global scale, I know I made the right choice. Even if it cost me everything I thought I wanted, even if it meant losing the family I thought I needed, even if it meant growing up faster than any 16-year-old should have to. Because the girls who lived, they were worth it. They are worth it. They will always be worth it. And as long as I have breath in my body and fight in my spirit, I'll keep making sure other girls know they're worth fighting for.